This week on Act Out, a special two-part episode that takes a look at how U.S. empire operates in two of its latest and long-standing efforts to terrorize and oppress foreign peoples, trample self-determination, and whitewash hearts and minds at home. Recently returned from trips to Venezuela and Iran, Kevin Zeese and Dr. Margaret Flowers sit down with me to discuss what U.S. imperialism looks like from the front lines, and how the people the U.S. targets are not only wise to these tactics, but they have no intention of submitting. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I walk next to the body of my baby. No!
Okay, so the U.S. designates Iran Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group. Before we get into the significance of that, what is the Iran Revolutionary Guard?
The Iran, military guard it's part of their military.
So it's basically like
it's their
our armed forces,
right?
Would be the parallel.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like the devil's advocate question, I guess, that I'm going to start with. Is there any truth? Now, I know that the U.S. designates like Black Lives Matter people as, or activists as terrorists.
Change activists.
So I'm not saying that, the U.S. designation of terrorist is a good thing. But that aside, in terms of playing devil's advocate here, is there any truth to the Iran Revolutionary Guard engaging in terrorist activity or supporting terrorists?
No. In fact, they're actually trying to prevent terrorism, and it's the United States that has been the perpetrator of acts within Iran, going way back to the 1950s, but even recently in the last year or so, when there was, legitimate workers protesting their wages, there's difficulty with hyperinflation there. Along the borders, the U.S. sent, infiltrators into there to try to change their messaging. Suddenly they were like, down with the government, where before it was like, we need higher wages. And they suspected that was U.S. involvement, because that's basically one of the playbook that the U.S. has used in Iran for a long time.
So with that, talk about the significance of this. Why even bother designating a military as a terrorist organization?
Well, the U.S. is trying to justify, our efforts to undermine Iran. We'd like to go, maybe go to war with Iran, certainly make life difficult for them. And so you have to keep demonizing them. And so they're, trying to make them into the next Al-Qaeda, right? And give that justification for intervention if the opportunity arises.
So why do you feel this isn't something that happened? I mean, obviously the revolution wasn't yesterday, so why have we waited this long?
Well, we've been trying to undermine them for a very long time, and I think the Trump administration is certainly accelerating that, accelerating the sanctions, pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement, and this is just, none of it is working. People are not buying into it. The Iranians are not backing down, cowering in fear. So it's just, the U.S. is like, okay, well, what's next in the playbook? Let's try this and see if this works.
When you were in Iran, was there a sense, did you get any sense of how the Iranian people feel about their military or their police or...
Well, so, Iran is a really interesting place to be because it's a country that's been around for 2,500 years. And so in many ways, you just get the feeling there that they're just so much more mature than we are, and very hospitable. They really pride themselves on, hospitality, and they were just incredibly welcoming to us. They are incredibly cooperative with each other. They have, legitimate grievances with their government. As every people do, but they have the right to have those grievances and determine how they want to deal with those grievances. But I think overall, we didn't have much interaction at all with the military. We definitely saw, some police out on the streets, but they're not, you don't get a sense that they're imposing. You don't get the sense that they're an occupying force like we have here in the United States. That you just see, especially in Tehran, which is a city of about 12 million people. It's so densely populated, and everybody just makes it work. They have it's amazing. It's like the traffic and the pedestrians, they flow like water. That's how they describe it. Like lanes are just a guideline. Nobody really like pays attention to them. So you could have a 3-lane road and 5 lanes of cars, plus motorcycles going in and out. And then you don't stop and wait on the street for the cars to stop because they will never stop. So you literally you just start. People are walking through the traffic, motorcycles are weaving their way, cars are going everywhere. Wow. And, you know, a car stops and people wait for them to do it. They don't like honk their horn or get upset. There's just this incredibly cooperative, mature feeling to that. But I never felt oppressed at all, or got the sense from people that they felt oppressed there.
What's been the international response? Because obviously, when we pulled out of the Iran peace deal, there was an international response, and from the other countries that are part of it. Has there been an international response with regards to this terrorist designation?
You know, I haven't seen a tremendous international response. It's really disappointing. And actually, the first day that we were in Iran, which was just in February, late February was when we went there. The first morning, we actually had a private meeting with the foreign minister, Javad Zarif. And he actually did his education through his PhD here in the United States. And at a very young age, right after they overthrew the monarchy with the Iranian Revolution and started their new constitution, he was actually the UN representative. He was like in his late 20s, but they're like, you're educated and you're there, so now you're the charge of affairs. And he talked about the whole, literally 10 years of trying to negotiate the Iran nuclear agreement with the United States and spending months on one sentence, how they were going to phrase it, and how the reason that they picked that as a first thing to negotiate is they were hoping that it would be a step, that then they could negotiate something else with the U.S. and something else. And they're like, well, this is an easy one because we don't want nuclear weapons. Yeah. We're not making nuclear weapons, so we can easily agree to this. And Iran did everything that they said that they were going to do. They had a nuclear reactor. They filled it in with cement. They got rid of half of their centrifuges. They got rid of their uranium. And people were so excited when that agreement was signed. Yeah, they said people were dancing in the streets. And, you know, a friend of ours that was there said I couldn't get to where I was going because it was so much celebration. What was interesting is that because the United States pulled out, people turned against kind of the government and said, you know, you were going to negotiate with the U.S. We trusted you. And look, you know,
what happened?
They didn't comply, and the U.S. didn't lift the sanctions as we promised. And what was really interesting is that the popularity, the public support for the Iran nuclear agreement went down to 51% from the high 80s. And the afternoon after we met with the foreign minister, he turned in his resignation. And this is, you know, speaks to the maturity of their culture. He said to the people, I have failed you, and so I'm stepping down. And it was really interesting because over the next 3 days, the members of the parliament across the political spectrum came together and wrote to the president and said, don't accept his resignation. The supreme leader said, don't accept his resignation. The people supported them, and they said, no, we recognize, you know, this is a very difficult situation. And so he was back in power. So when the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, there were, you know, other countries, Germany and France and other countries that were involved, and the Iranians were really hoping that they would step up and do something about it. And unfortunately, what they're seeing is that they're not, and that the U.S. just has such a dominant hand right now that that they're not providing support to Iran. And what's fairly devastating is the floods that are going on there right now, and the fact that in the past when Iran had emergencies like this, other countries would step in with aid, and now they're not doing that, partly because of their fear of the U.S. and also the economic coercive measures that we're using against Iran.
Which really it speaks to that fact that although the U.S. is an empire in decline, it's still an empire, and we still hold sway over not just the countries where we stage wars, but the countries that we demand the complicity from, like European nations.
Right. They're starting to, you know, rebel a little bit, but they're definitely not ready to full-on rebel yet.
In terms of, because this was also a question with regards to Venezuela, what about Russia and China and other quote-unquote superpowers? China's, you know, a rising superpower. What about their response to these moves, getting out of the Iran deal and then this designation? Do you think that there will be a response, or is this just another case of like, you know what, we're just not going to touch that.
I mean, I think that they're allies of Iran. I wouldn't be surprised if they stepped in. I mean, they do business with Iran. So, you know, I don't see it as a big player right now like we see in Venezuela, which is so imminently. I mean, we are literally waging a war against Venezuela. We're just doing it in the, you know, everything else besides a full-on assault. So that's a really emergency situation. I don't think we're in the same situation quite yet with Iran, but we could, you know, we could be there.
Well, and on that point, I also wanted to ask you about there's legislation that's been introduced that it suggests that we can't go to war with Iran unless Congress says that we can, which to me is like redundant for the War Powers Act, but it also speaks to the AUMF. Would this be pulling back the AUMF? Would this be saying that no, as Congress, we are reasserting our power on the issue of war and violent intervention?
I think that's the goal. I think, you know, basically what we're just seeing, and this is what, if you look at the Pentagon reports, which are really interesting, a few years ago they came out with one called the post-primacy report, which was basically, we recognize that our hegemony in the world is declining, and so their responses to that were, well, we need more military funding, we need to expand our military, we need to do more surveillance, we need to be more aggressive, and so we're seeing all this increase in military spending. I'm hoping that this is something that maybe there are some saner minds that are saying, hey, maybe this is not the best idea. And you know, it's kind of like this this caged animal in crisis, you know, and it could be really rogue and do something dangerous. And I hope that this is a measure to try to cage that, you know, stop that a little bit, calm that down.
Would you put all of your hope in that basket, or do you think that because of other issues we wouldn't go to war with Iran?
Oh, I mean, do I have any hope in that actually being effective? No, I mean, we have. I'm sorry. I thought that was
were you
obvious.
Asking if I have hope in our Congress? Oh, hell no.
No, I mean, well, just look at. I mean, you know, the Pentagon asks for money, and Congress gives them more than they ask for, and it's overwhelming bipartisan support for that. It's nearly unanimous. You know, that Trump mentions things about, you know, maybe we should get out of NATO. You know, and his reasons are they're not, you know, buying enough of our weapons. They need to be putting more money in, but Congress turns around and passes a bill saying basically you can't use any money to withdraw from NATO, and we support NATO. Go NATO. You know, we just over and over again see that this Congress is, both major parties are war parties. We see them parroting, you know, these talking points, these U.S. intervention talking points against other countries, no matter how progressive these members of Congress are. They continue to perpetuate these fallacies about other countries that justify U.S. intervention in them. So, no, I think that if there's really a move in that direction, unless the people do something about it, like we did in 2014 when President Obama was trying to overtly attack Syria, and people stopped that, and then he had to find other ways to do it. I think that definitely would go to war.
And what's your sense of having been to Iran, but also being an organizer in the U.S., what's your sense of in the U.S.? Is there a movement, or could there be a movement behind that if that were more imminent?
I think we still need to do a lot of work. You know, there's so many misperceptions about Iran. Even our own family members were telling us, oh, it's so dangerous there, don't go there, it's, you know, are you going to be okay? And the people were so lovely. I mean, literally everywhere we went, people were friendly, they were happy to see us. We were wearing these name tags that had our names in English and in Farsi. Arabic, and in Farsi, and people would like read our names. They'd be like, "Hi, Margaret," you know? And then they try to practice their English. And you walk into a store and you have to sit down and have tea or cookies or candy. It's like, you know, very hospitable people there. It's completely the opposite of what you hear. And because it's an Islamic republic, I think that scares people because there is so much propaganda against the Muslim religion or Muslim people. But that's interesting because that's a response to what the U.S. did. So we overthrew a secular government in 1953, Mossadegh, installed a Shah who was a U.S. puppet, who really westernized Iran, the culture, you know, and the fashion and all that. But then in 1979, with the revolution, they overthrew the Shah and they turned against the West because they saw the West as being, a dominant force. And so their response was, well, we want our own culture. We're going to be Islamic. And so when you talk to a lot of women there about things like wearing the hijab, they were like, don't tell us what to do. Don't impose your values upon us. We're going to decide as Iranians how we want to be. So we really kind of created this anti-Western sentiment, which was starting to change, interestingly. We talked to a professor at the University of Tehran, and he said the younger people were starting to question their parents. Well, why did you rise up against the Shah? What was so bad about Western stuff? The fact that we pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, they suddenly get it. And they're like, oh, now we understand why you were anti-West. So we're fueling anti-West sentiment there.
Yeah, which is, of course, the ironic thing, but, the war on terror creates more terrorists, and when you try to force someone into your way of thinking and your way of life, then they will blow back to their own, and oftentimes that can look more conservative.
When we left when we've been behaving in a way that's very disrespectful of them, it's really sad that we're doing that. All they really want is their sovereignty. All they want is to be able to live their lives. They want to live their lives. And we've been using unilateral coercive economic measures against them for 40 years, ever since the Islamic Revolution. And it is having an impact on them.
Yeah, of course. And I think this speaks to the idea that, there's a common misconception, and I heard this a lot with Venezuela. People would tweet at me or send me a message and they'd say, oh my gosh, you must love Maduro. I'm like, I don't know enough to know whether I love the guy. I just know that it's none of my business.
Right.
It's none of my business whether they want to vote for him or not.
Right.
And I think it's not to say that Iran doesn't have problems.
Right.
But it's to say that it's not my place to decide who they have in power or what they do as a people.
And it was interesting because I didn't understand a lot about how the Iranian government works. After the revolution, they wrote a constitution to try to create their form of a democracy. And, I don't think there's a perfect democracy in the world right now. So theirs definitely has flaws, and they know that. And they're like, well, we'd really like to work on it if we weren't constantly trying to keep the U.S. off our back. But they have a very active parliament. We went there one day and observed. They welcomed us, and we met with some of the members of parliament, and they were having a very strong debate. It was coming down to the time for their budget, and they were, each side was kind of like, well, we need money for this and we need money for that, and very active debate. The supreme leader, who people look at him as like this kind of supreme leader, he actually, they elect the council of their Islamic council, and then that council chooses the supreme leader, and they can also take the supreme leader away if he's failing to live up to his duties. So it's not like it's not like a monarchy where he has all power.
And something interesting about the misperception or the misunderstanding of life there is something that I've heard, because I do some work with Press TV, and one of the things that I would often hear is that as a woman, as a feminist, do you feel uncomfortable? And I've never been to Iran, so I certainly can't speak to how I feel about being in Iran, but I wanted to have you speak about that because I'm sure some of the viewers are thinking about that right now, that as a woman, did you feel lesser than being there and knowing that you had to wear a head covering or anything like that?
No, I mean, we wore the head covering because this was like the first U.S. delegation they had let in. We had to go through a lot of vetting in order to get our visa because they're very wary about people from the U.S. And we didn't want to really rock any boats. We wanted to make it possible for other people from the U.S. To visit there. But no, it didn't seem that, that women were treated. It's certainly not Saudi Arabia by any stretch of the imagination. And, 60% of their university students are women. The professor joked with us. We met his PhD students who were doing American studies, and they were all women. And he says, well, they tested higher than the men, so that's why, they got it. There's a lot of women entrepreneurs there. But again, it's interesting because when we talk to women there, their sense of what they want is different than what the way that we define feminism, and we can't impose our views on them. So it was interesting. The one woman said, well, we have a lot more freedom because we don't have the responsibility of making money for the family, to support the family. So, she felt that gave her as a woman freedom to do what she wanted to do.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I remember a conversation that I had with a woman in Cuba because I asked her, do you find it degrading that guys whistle at you when you walk by? And she says, no, I like it. It means that I have power over them. And I was like, well, I never thought of it that way, but okay. Because in my mind, like, that pissed me off.
Yeah.
But in her mind, that was a recognition of her power over men. And that was an interesting...
Yeah.
So yeah, that idea that what we grow up with understanding as feminism or female power is really our understanding. And it's not everyone's understanding. And on top of that, more importantly, it's really not for us as American women to say, well, you have to be this kind of feminist.
This is part of white supremacy,
Yeah.
right? We think that our, Euro-American ways are the ways that everybody should be, that we're the perfect ones. We've got it right. People should be like us. And we've got to break that down.
Yeah.
We've got, this is all part of decolonization that needs to go on. And so part of it is recognizing how we impose our colonist views on others.
Right, and how we perpetuate that even in those seemingly tiny ways.
Right.
So right now, how are you? How can folks get involved with this ongoing issue, particularly as it seems like with that terrorist designation, we are ramping up. Not as bad as Venezuela, but we are ramping up our assault on Iran.
Well, I love that the Iranians turned right around and said the U.S. government is a terrorist organization.
Which is very true.
Because it is true, and it just shows you their spirit. They have been fighting U.S. imperialism for decades now, and they see us as these teenage bullies, these immature bullies is really how they view us. And they're just like, would you just cut it out, And so they're like, we're not backing down. We haven't backed down. They call their economy a resistance economy, that they've been developing a resistance economy to resist the U.S. coercive measures. So basically, I think what we need to do in the United States is we need to understand more about what's going on in Iran, not in the way that it's being told in the U.S. corporate media. So as Kevin mentioned about Venezuela at popularresistance.org, we're trying to cover that. I think we need to try to develop more relationships with people in Iran, because even the American studies students, they're not allowed to come to the United States. So they can't actually have those interactions with people. And not many people from the U.S. can go there. So they're trying to do things virtually, where people can have exchanges virtually. So, if people or professors are interested in doing that. They can't translate our books to Farsi because of the economic measures. Even if an author in the U.S. is willing to let them translate it, they can't execute the contract with the publishing company because of the sanctions. So we're looking at ways to do some sorts of book exchanges with them, and they're finding ways around it by creating new books where they have half the content from the other book, but they add new content into it so that it's not a copyright violation. I think we definitely need to push the United States to drop the coercive economic measures. We must get back into the nuclear agreement. We must live up to our end of the bargain. It's almost like we felt shame being there when we saw the way that our country was behaving towards them. It was definitely not a moment to be proud of the United States. And if the U.S. is, ramping up its belligerence, we really need to, put pressure on our members of Congress. In fact, when I got back from Iran, I wrote a report for my member of Congress about the visits that we had, what we learned, and my recommendations. Because in particular, my member of Congress really doesn't focus at all on foreign policy. He's okay on domestic policy, but he doesn't have any clue about foreign policy. Right. And so I wanted him to have a balance to what he's hearing, from the military lobbyists that he hears from, and whatever the interests are in Congress. I think people should be educating their members of Congress about this.
Absolutely. Margaret's point about white supremacy and imperialism dictating one brand of feminism is really important. And at the core of these conversations lies self-determination, the right of people, including women, to dictate their own lives. Solidarity work truly begins when we offer support for self-determination without imposing our ideologies as a precursor to that support. And that's not to say that Iran doesn't have problems, that Venezuela doesn't have problems. It's to say that it's not our place to instill our wants or demands on anyone else. Our place, as children of this empire, is to crush imperialism and to legitimately acknowledge, respect, and support autonomy worldwide. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out our conversation with Kevin Zeese on Venezuela, an important and very pressing piece of this imperialist puzzle, available at the link below, via the link in the show description, and of course, via Free Speech TV.
The economic war is creating hyperinflation. It's a combination of various factors that does it, but part of it is that Wall Street sets the value of the bolivar versus the dollar. And when they do that, that creates an opportunity for speculation and black market. And so, it's a challenging situation for the government to handle. I think a military intervention would be a disaster for the United States. It would be a disaster for Venezuela too, but it would be a trap the United States wouldn't be able to get out of, and it would cost trillions of dollars. Just like we spent 7 or 8 trillion in the Middle East since 2011, 9/11. The reality is Venezuela is 6 times as large as Iraq. It has a military of 200,000. It has a National Guard and police. It has, since Trump started talking about military attack, they've escalated their civilian militia. Mm-hmm. The People's Militia is now 2 million people, armed and trained. I told that to Colonel Ann Wright. That's bigger than the U.S. military. And it's not a simple Venezuela also has anti-aircraft weapons that are very sophisticated. They've just installed them, and so they won't have the air cover. U.S. won't have the air cover in a much more jungle terrain, and that's going to be very dangerous for any U.S. or Colombian or Brazil invasion. It would be a disaster for everybody, and be a quagmire for the United States, and probably another defeat. But he's very confident in his people, and he believes in the power of popular movements. Yeah. Because popular movements remove the United States.
Exactly.
Remove the oligarchs from power. An older woman came up to our group. It was about 8 people we had with us, and she said, she talked to our person, found out we were Americans, and she said, tell your president, I know you want our oil, but treat us with respect, no, there's no invasion.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a fighter.